What exactly is Russiagate?
To me, Russiagate is the allegation that Russia, according to US intelligence officials, waged this sweeping interference campaign in 2016 via hacked emails and social media posts with the aim of sowing chaos in the US and installing Donald Trump in the White House. And furthermore, the suspicion that Donald Trump and his campaign conspired with this sweeping Russian campaign. There was a quid pro quo, or Vladimir Putin has a P tape of Donald Trump and used that to blackmail him. That Russia basically invaded us with their troll army and their email hackers, and they did so in concert with in a grand conspiracy with Donald Trump. And this was the fashionable narrative of American liberalism for, you know, close to 4 years. And a lot of people got swept up in it, even on the progressive side, even in progressive media. It's I haven't seen anything like it before. It's like, to me, there are a lot of comparisons to the Iraq scandal, like to Iraq WMDs, but with Iraq, I mean, at least in that case, Saddam is a dictator and he had used chemical weapons before. So, like, there was some element of potential truth there. I never bought into it, obviously, but I got why some people got duped by it, especially given the relentless barrage of propaganda that we got. But in this case, in the case of Russiagate, we also got a relentless barrage of media propaganda. But this time it's so ludicrous and stupid. Beginning with the premise of this Russian interference thing, like, even if all the allegations against Russia are true, are we really going to compare, as is what happened, hacked emails and social media posts to Pearl Harbor and 9/11, which is what prominent Democrats did? And then you get to the collusion thing, which was just, it's a conspiracy theory. There's QAnon on the right, and there's BlueAnon on the Democratic side. I mean, this was a conspiracy theory, and the conspiracy theories never stopped. And every time one conspiracy theory was undermined, there was a new one to take its place, or some explanation to rationalize the failure of the conspiracy theory. The P tape, Alpha Bank, like this Russian bank secretly communicating with Trump Tower, Carter Page going to Moscow, getting promised billions of dollars in a Russian bank, Michael Cohen going to Prague for secret meetings with Russian hackers. It just goes on and on and on. It never stops. Paul Manafort sharing polling data with a Russian operative. And incredibly, a lot of people in the media and bought into it. And that's because simply the evidence was always there to undermine it. But anyone who took part in it basically ignored the countervailing evidence and pushed out propaganda. And there are a lot of reasons for why Russiagate persisted. I think it's a convergence of a few things. For one, the obvious one was that neoliberal Democrats were humiliated by Trump's victory. I mean, this clown, buffoon reality TV show host managed to convince enough people that he was better than the Democrats and that he was some kind of working class champion. And the faith in Democrats was so low that enough people in the swing states were willing to take that chance on him. And so that was humiliating for Democrats. And so blaming Russia was a way to avoid introspection. Blaming Russia was also a way for Democrats to avoid challenging their own position, their own powerful position in the dysfunctional US system whose failings gave rise to Trump. So this was a perfect foil for them. And then for the media, it was good too, because instead of looking at this, the dysfunctions of this country and the oligarchs of this country who own them and pay their salaries and buy their advertisements, instead it was very convenient to pretend as if Russian oligarchs and Vladimir Putin were the causes of all of our problems, and not our own dysfunctions here, and not the fact that our media gave Trump billions of dollars in airtime, in free airtime. And then there's also this, the national security state aspect, which is that Trump, when he ran, he talked about having better relations with Russia, but not just that, he also criticized US interventions abroad. So he painted himself completely deceptively because he hasn't done anything to implement it. In fact, he's been worse in some ways. but he painted himself completely deceptively as this anti-interventionist. He criticized the destruction of Libya. He criticized the proxy war in Syria, and he talked about cooperating with Russia. And there was even a study that showed that in communities where military sacrifice was highest, in countries where there was a highest rate of residents who had lost loved ones to wars, that correlated with a higher rate of support for Trump, because I think that message resonated, especially when contrasted to Hillary Clinton, who is the embodiment of interventionism, given her record and the Clintons' record and the Obama administration's record too. So for the national security state, then for them to paint Trump as this pawn of Russia, it served this convenient purpose of criminalizing his any kind of diplomacy with Russia that he would have carried out, and B, undermining the rhetorical appeal of his anti-interventionist rhetoric. And again, I stress rhetoric because again, it wasn't sincere. I think he had his finger on the pulse of the electorate, and he played to that. Again, when he came into office, he was just as hawkish as Obama in certain areas and even more hawkish in other areas. So that was a con. But ascribing all this to him being a pawn of Putin was a way to stigmatize the appeal of an anti-interventionist rhetoric. And we saw that when all of a sudden, instead of, a resistance to Trump being organized around real issues, initially it was with the protests against the Muslim ban and the Women's March, but soon it became about putting all of our faith in the national security state and, worshiping them as our heroes, and the entire liberal resistance being sidelined and pacified and doing nothing. There was not much organizing. Basically, we had to watch MSNBC and CNN and wait for Robert Mueller, this silver-haired patrician, Marine veteran, former FBI director. He was now the face of resistance, and he was going to solve all of our problems. So we were demobilized from being involved around real issues, which was great for the Democratic Party, which doesn't care about real issues really. And that helped preserve their status to the point where, there were bigger protests to save Jeff Sessions' job when Trump fired him than there were to save the Iran nuclear deal or to save Obamacare. I mean, if you look back, when Jeff Sessions got fired right after the midterms in November 2018, liberals organized protests in hundreds of cities for Jeff Sessions, this racist like a Republican, because we were told that him being fired might imperil the Mueller probe. So you can see the interest that were served there, and you can see how great this was for the Democratic neoliberals who lost to Trump in 2016, because all of this demobilized the party and prevented anybody from being organized around real issues like healthcare, where instead our focus was just to protect the Mueller probe. It was a perfect scam, and it worked out great for them. I mean, I've always thought that Russiagate was not just a fake way to resist Trump. It was also a way for neoliberals to resist becoming the party of Bernie Sanders, because that was the obvious lesson from 2016. If you lose to a con man who is falsely claiming to be a working class champion, then the obvious answer is to embrace real working class politics and a real working class champion. And the best hope for that, obviously, was Bernie Sanders. So making this all about Russia and not about the Democrats' own failures was a great way to avoid being Bernie Sanders' party. And we saw that expressed when, as Bernie was, coming up in the primaries, he had squeaked away with a victory in Iowa. He took New Hampshire, and then he was about to win Nevada. And then Bernie got Russiagated. They leaked this thing saying that Vladimir Putin, U.S. intelligence believes that Vladimir Putin is helping Bernie. It was no surprise that Bernie got Russiagated, because Bernie Sanders, I think, was always a tacit target of this whole thing, because the most important thing was protecting neoliberal power.
Wow, yeah, no, that's a good point. How you tied it into how Bernie Sanders got Russiagated as well. I actually didn't even consider that. Your comments, there's so much to unpack there. There's like there's so much to unpack. But we'll start. I guess let's start with okay, to be clear then, so Russiagate, I guess, as I understand it, is this theory that Trump was some sort of either puppet of Vladimir Putin or colluding with Putin or Russia for his own election purposes. Um, so my question for you is, when you say that, that's false or overblown, or there's no evidence for that, and then when people respond and they say, well, what about these convictions here, or what about those convictions there? What is your response to that?
Well, when it comes to the convictions and the charges against Trump figures, none of them had anything to do with Trump-Russia collusion. What I think happened was, I think the FBI knew very early on that they had no collusion case. I mean, the basis for the probe is ridiculous. The FBI got a tip from an Australian diplomat that this low-level Trump campaign volunteer, George Papadopoulos, had gotten some kind of suggestion that Russia could help its campaign. And when I say some kind of suggestion, that's a literal quote from the FBI document that opened up Crossfire Hurricane, the collusion probe, which means that the nature of this tip was incredibly vague. It was that this low level Trump guy had suggested that he'd gotten some kind of suggestion that Russia could help it out. Nothing explicit about, like, we're going to give you these hacked emails and we're going to help, and we're going to, release social media posts or whatever it is. It was just some vague thing. And that's what prompted this sprawling collusion investigation. And instead of recognizing that they had nothing, the FBI doubled down. They went on to use the Steele dossier, which is this ridiculous document paid for by the Clinton campaign, which alleged the thing about the P tape and Carter Page going to Moscow and getting offered a stake in the Russian gas giant, and Michael Cohen going to Prague. And they used that to get a surveillance warrant on Page. And they kept doubling down and more and more and more. And finally, when they realized they had nothing, they started charging people, I think, to justify their initial dumb decision to open up the probe to begin with. So Paul Manafort, what was he charged with? He was charged with tax crimes and lobbying crimes that had nothing to do with Trump 2016 or even Russia. It was all about his work in Ukraine. And by the way, in Ukraine, the work he was doing, he was trying to move his client away from Russia, which was something that got conveniently completely distorted in how Manafort was covered. So every single case, there's no allegation of collusion. It's things that are unrelated to Trump and Russia, and it's process crimes. And they nailed people for perjury charges in the case of George Papadopoulos and Michael Flynn, that if you actually look back on the evidence, weren't even valid. It's not even clear that they actually lied. And if they lied, they were completely inconsequential. So I think that those indictments, which is what law enforcement does sometimes, were not based on anything valid, but they were just there to justify the underlying case and give the public something. And the Mueller team, they wrote a lot of indictments that kind of suggested that they had something on collusion, but it was obvious to me from the start, and I wrote this from the very beginning, that they were being disingenuous, that they were suggesting that they had something. But ultimately, if you read the whole thing, no evidence ever of any collusion ever comes up. It's all innuendo. And I think they were doing that to fuel a media narrative. And they were doing that, to basically, because I don't think that these national security state officials like Trump. And, I don't like Trump either. But I don't think that weaponizing the FBI and the CIA to do that, to challenge Trump, is legitimate. Because we have to apply our standards to everybody, and B, I don't want that playbook applied to a future progressive. If there's a future progressive candidate who the FBI and the CIA don't like, and I hope they don't. I hope one day we have a candidate who U.S. intelligence doesn't like. I don't want to legitimate a playbook that says that they have the right to go and pursue ridiculous investigations that tie them up and smear them for cynical reasons. So the problem was, though, the media did such a horrible job at accurately reporting all these indictments and all these allegations and court filings, and the media cherry picked and did its best to also portray the narrative that there was something there to this Russia thing, because it played great with their audience. It was great for ratings, and it served the imperatives of Russiagate, where you're opposing Trump through any means, but actually focusing on real issues. And so everyone just kind of went along with this. It was this all-consuming racket, and only those who had the time. I mean, like, I work in media, so luckily I had the time to go through all the indictments, but most people don't. So people were just left with what media was telling them, and the media was giving them a very misleading picture, and that's what kept us going for so long, unfortunately. And that's what, even a lot of well-meaning people that I know still think that there is something there because they, I don't blame them. They weren't told anything else. And voices like mine who were trying to point out the actual facts were marginalized. We didn't get airtime on cable networks, and even in progressive media too. There just wasn't that much space for us.
Well, there's space for you at Mass Peace Action. So, anyways.